The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is a pleasure today to rise in this House of Commons to speak to Bill C-26, and I am very pleased to represent the interests of people in my riding. It is a pleasure, Madam Speaker. This bill creates a historical site commission. This bill gives the minister the following powers: recognition of the national historic importance or national interest of a certain site. It also gives regulatory powers, and we had a bit of a problem with this. The government and council can pass regulations with respect to historical sites.
Where we might differ a little.
There are many other regulatory powers that are concerning.
Main parts of this bill that we strongly support, of course, is the call to action number 79 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And if I may read those into the record here very quickly, Madam Chairman, we call upon the federal government in collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal organizations, and the arts community to develop a reconciliation framework for Canadian heritage and commemoration. This would include, but not be limited to, 1, amending the Historic Sites and Monuments Act to include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis representation on the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada and its Secretariat. It's the most important part of this one, and that is also what's in this bill that we need to support strongly. This is something that has gone on for too long in Canada, where we're not including the most important part of our history, pre-colonialization, in the decisions in the historic sites across Canada. I don't know how that happened. I've been exploring it in my riding and across Canada, but where the division happened between what was a real consensus between the colonialists that came to Canada and the First Nations that were here before they came to Canada. They used to work very much hand in hand together. And somewhere in our history, that compact seemed to get broken, and we seem to be separate entities. And we're only coming past that dark part of our history in these years as we deal with things in the House of Commons here. This call to action, of course, is part of that reconciliation, and an important part of this bill that we need to make sure we instill in law here in Canada and in the laws going forward. There's other things in this bill that are a huge regulatory overstep. The Minister of the Environment, in this case, will have the sole authority to designate a historic site. That might sound innocuous to my colleagues. It's not so innocuous when you look at everything that's been given to this minister, that he's made gross oversteps upon. And I could give a few examples here. First thing I'm going to talk about is the Impact Assessment Act. The thing about the Impact Assessment Act, passed in 2019, August 2019, is that it allowed this minister, not government and council, the cabinet, but this minister alone, Minister of the Environment, to actually say, yes, I get to approve a resource development by myself in any parts of Canada, or I get to disapprove of such resource development, which is contrary to the Canadian Constitution. The Canadian Constitution allows, of course, resource development in the provinces to be the purview of the provinces. It's only when it crosses provincial boundaries that the federal government, or in this case the federal Minister of the Environment, might get involved. This was an overstep. That overstep was recognized by the Alberta Court of Appeal in May of 2022 when they overturned by a good margin, 4-1, the actual constitutionality of the Impact Assessment Act. What was lost to Canada in those 3 years, almost 3 years, between the passage of the bill and the overturning of the bill, ruling it unconstitutional in the Alberta Court of Appeal, is 3 years of project developments in Canada's natural resource industry. Now that's a whole bunch of uncertainty and hundreds of billions of dollars of projects, thousands upon thousands of jobs, literally hundreds of thousands of jobs, and billions of revenue, billions of taxation revenue to this government to pay for things like healthcare and education. And we'll note the deficits this government has plunged themselves into as a result of not having enough revenue to pay for the programming that they're so fond of signing checks for. This is a problem. So the Impact Assessment Act is in limbo right now until it's going to the Supreme Court of Canada after being overturned by the Alberta Court of Appeal. People need to recognize the Alberta Court of Appeal is 5 justices, all appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada. So this is not an Alberta versus federal decision. This is actually people that are appointed by the federal government that have overturned a piece of federal legislation soundly. And I think anybody that is actually a constitutionalist around here can actually look at that and say, if the constitutional authority rests with the provinces, why does the federal Minister of the Environment by himself get the authority to turn this over and say, no, the provinces can't do this? It defies constitutional law, and I'm going to be wondering what happens when the Supreme Court of Canada actually hears this, if they're going to acquiesce or they're going to agree with everybody else in Canada that says, yes, this has been a gross overstep and needs to end. The second thing I'm going to talk about is something that happened this past summer. In June of 2022, the Minister of the Environment thrust some new regulations upon it's the Migratory Birds Act. It's regulation to actually say you cannot construct anything anymore if you discover a pileated woodpecker nest anywhere near your construction site for 3 years. Well, no sooner did that new regulation go through, and regulations don't come to the House, you'll know that, Madam Speaker. They actually go through just the hand-sorting process. So all of a sudden that became a regulation that impeded the progress of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which had been under construction for a number of years at that point in time and is still under construction. And there's a reason it's grossly over budget, because this Minister of the Environment keeps putting roadblocks in the way to getting it completed. Matter of fact, he stated he does not want to ever see this pipeline created. In stark contrast to his Minister of Finance, who's responsible for the entity that actually builds the pipeline, who says we need to build this pipeline, you've got a conflict here at Cabinet. Governor and Council, now you've got one minister able to make this decision in so much of these regulations that are going forward. This is a problem in our governance. A serious problem. We've already been exposed to what it means. $30 billion, $22 billion over budget for a major Crown project. That is obscene. And that is something Canadian taxpayers are paying for. Dissonance on the front bench of the Liberal government. Get your act together, I would say to the Liberals, Madam Chair. But this is something that we need to kind of make sure we don't replicate in this legislation going forward. It is a gross overstep. Not to be outdone, I should add one more thing about the TMX pipeline. TMX pipeline is over budget. The benefit of the TMX pipeline at the end of the day is that we are actually going to receive about $22 billion a year in national benefit as a result of the building of this pipeline. So in as much as the project itself is not going to pay the proponent the amount of money that's gone into it, we need to acknowledge that. It is a huge benefit for this country on a yearly basis going forward. Think about that, $22 billion in revenue per year going forward, and we're way behind on getting it built. I'll also talk about the budget in 2019, where the Minister of the Environment couldn't get things one way, so he got things another, when he actually...
Yes, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary on a point of order.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I've been very patient in listening to the member, and he's talking about everything but, it seems, Bill C-23, when you're talking about oil development and the type of thing he's been talking about for the last...
There's a lot of platitude in what is permissible in speeches. Yes, and the Honourable Member has made mentions of the bill in question. Please proceed. The Honourable Member has 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the intervention from my learned colleague, as always. Let me say Budget 2019 was another example of the Minister of Environment overstepping in such a way as we're seeing the authority being given in this bill when they actually unilaterally withdrew lands that were designed for ski resorts in the Rocky Mountains without even discussing with the proponents of that. What's the problem here? All kinds of things. This is about waterways regulation that's going to be unilateral. This is about development in lands that's going to be unilateral approval or disapproval by one minister. We've already seen in my speech, which was very relevant, I think, Madam Speaker, how this affects negatively our country. And we need to make sure that we address that and make sure that parts of this do not go forward as written, but make sure that we have full authority of the government and they have proper authority in order to make this happen. Now, the minister may want all this authority. It's not up to this House of Commons to give him alone that authority. Madam Speaker, thank you very much. Je vous remercie pour...
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak today, and now I'm ready for questions.
Questions and comments.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, to the Minister of Rural Development, Economic Rural Development. Thank you, Madam Speaker. First and foremost, I would like to thank my colleague and congratulate him for his French. Excellent, thank you. My colleague also mentions in his speech that he would like to remove the responsibility and the evaluation for heritage sites from the minister. But this bill really does respond very well to the call to action 79 on recommendation. But if it's not the minister who should do this, who is in the best position to do this? Because the minister and his whole team can negotiate with all levels of government, including the city. So I'd like to know what my honourable colleague thinks about that.
Calgary Centre.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. It's a good one. But it's not the minister himself who's in charge of approving regulations. It's the government in council who's in charge, the cabinet, who is responsible for Canadian laws, not just one minister, but all ministers. And as I've said, there seems to be an arm wrestle between the Minister of Finance and the government with respect to Trans Mountain Pipeline. And this can't continue. Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Saint-Hubert. I'd also like to thank my colleague for his French. All the efforts that members make in this House with respect to French are very important. Right now, there is a decline in French that is being seen across the country, and I think it's important to send a message in this House, across Canada as well, that we are concerned with French. So I congratulate my colleague. With respect to this bill, C-23, it's somewhat boring because everyone agrees. There are a few points, but we agree in general. It's somewhat boring. I'd like to know from my colleague, since this bill is unanimous with respect to Indigenous peoples and reconciliation, does he not agree there are really more important action that could be taken? Yes, let's move forward with this and vote on this bill. But there's our housing issues. There's homelessness and spousal violence. We know that 8% of assassinated women in Canada are Indigenous versus 4% in the general population. So there are many areas that have not yet been addressed by this government. So does my colleague not agree we need to act as quickly as possible? Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague also for his question. The call to action 79. It is a call for a representative that is Inuit or Métis on the board of directors on the Government of Canada to pass these regulations. That is one of the calls to action, not the others. The other calls to action are very important as well. But in this respect, we're looking at the call to action 79, but we don't agree with the powers that we're giving now to the Minister of the Environment. This legislation allows the minister himself only to give approval for such sites.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Skeena-Buckley Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I listened to my colleague from Calgary Centre's interesting speech on National Historic Sites. He spent a great deal of time talking about the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and it did pique my interest and made me think that perhaps there's a category of historic sites that has been egregiously overlooked by the federal government, and that is boondoggles. And I wonder if perhaps my friend would support the preemptive designation of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, a pipeline that is costing Canadian taxpayers some $30 billion, as a National Historic Site. Perhaps he could offer his thoughts. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And we are in accord with our friends in the NDP in this regard. This has been a gross overspend. We would like to see exactly where the money has been spent. But in the annals of Canadian history, to be $22 billion over on a $7.5 billion project before the government got involved shows exactly what's wrong with this government, because it thinks it can spend its way without any accountability whatsoever. This bill we're talking about...
We have to resume debate.